Hi, I'm Alex from Soldering Stained Glass. Welcome to video 3 in our series of techniques videos. In this video we'll be teaching you how to lead up a window. Video 2 took care of cutting the glass, that's all done. We're ready for our next stage. The design that we're making is a very slight variation on the one you can see behind me here. I've resized it to an A4 format. If you visit our website www.sunriseglass.co.uk you can actually print off the design and make this yourself at home. Like I said, it's A4 size, so you can just print it off on your printer. The first thing that we need to lead up a window is a board to lead it up on. I've got one here. You need a wooden board, and you just need to make sure that your board is big enough for your whole window to fit on. The second thing we need is the plan or copy of our original drawing that we made. We also made that in video 1. I have that here, and this is going to be our guide when we're leading up. So we need to fix this to our board. Next thing is a couple of strips of wood like this. We're going to put one along the bottom and one along one side. If you're right-handed you might find it easier to put the piece of wood on the left. Obviously vice versa, if you're left-handed you might want to put the piece of wood on the right. Really doesn't matter. Now we need to line these pieces of wood up exactly with the edged line of our design. If you printed off the design on the computer, then the edge of the page represents this line that we're going to. So in this case I've drawn on the edge line on the copy and we're going to that. That represents the outermost border of our window. So I'm going to fix this board in with a couple of horseshoe nails and a small hammer. Just make sure it's exactly lined up with our border line, and a few taps to nail that in. Now just make sure it's exactly lined up again. There we go. Now I'm going to line up our next piece of wood. Get a nail in down here. And as we're making a rectangular window, we want this angle here to be exactly 90 degrees. So we're going to use an L square, any square will do, just to check that that angle is exactly correct and exactly 90 degrees. There we go. Now I'm just going to put in a few more nails to make sure that's all secure. And double check. And as you can see, we have our design. It's held on by these pieces of wood. The wood comes right up to our border line on these two sides, and if I check it with a right angle, it's exactly square. I've just popped down into another part of the studio to demonstrate how we stretch lead. Before you use lead, it needs to be stretched. This removes any kinks and also strengthens it. To stretch your lead, you need to use a lead vise, which looks like this. I'm going to insert the lead, close the jaws, and the serrated jaws will grip it. So when I pull on the lead this way, it will be held in place. Once the lead is in your vise, make sure you remove any twists so you've got it the right way around when you pull. Grab the end with some pliers, hold it nice and tight and tug it. And that's probably stretched out about enough, and we can undo it from the lead vise. The type of lead you use in your project is really up to you. The two main kinds are flat and round. We've used a flat lead on the border, and I'm going to use a 5mm round lead for our internal lead lines. The difference is when you look at them in profile, you see that H profile. The top and bottom are flat on flat lead, and they're slightly domed on a round lead. A round lead is generally a little bit stronger and a bit more aesthetically pleasing. However, it is more expensive because it uses more materials. Flat lead is better for a border. If you were going to fit a window, for example, into a frame and you were going to use a beading to hold it in place, then flat lead would be ideal for the perimeter. For bordering a window, you can also use a C, or sometimes called U section lead, which looks like a H section lead but only has a channel on one side. so you can use that to border pieces. You'd have to make allowance for that in your drawing. We've drawn this out to use a 10mm lead, and we're using a flat lead for the border. Like I said, I'm going to use a 5mm round lead for our internal lead lines. You might choose to use something a bit wider. If you're a beginner, a wider lead will cover more errors, and if your cutting technique isn't quite there yet and your cutting isn't as accurate as you like it to be, a wider lead can cover quite a lot of little errors and things. Very hard to get away with mistakes when you're using a very thin lead. The first thing that we're going to do here is put a strip of our 10mm lead across where both of these pieces of wood are. So I have the lead here. Now we need to cut it. As lead is very soft, all you need to cut it is a lead knife. A lead knife looks like this. We're going to position this piece of lead so we can just measure off roughly how much we need, or you can gauge it with your square. So I'd say about that much will do. I'm just going to use my lead knife directly on top of the lead, rock it back and forth slightly, and keep a consistent pressure straight down. If you press too hard too quickly, you'll crush the internal heart of the lead and the lead will collapse. It will be no good. So you want a nice clean cut down, just like that. And now you can see the H-shaped profile of the lead. We want straight through at 90 degrees. And if we put this piece of lead on our drawing, it lines up perfectly with the lines we've already drawn. Now we'll just cut another bit for this side. We can cut it slightly long because we can trim that down later. Now this rather unusual looking tool is called a Nova tool or a FID, and it's used for flattening down or opening up the channels inside your lead. Quite a useful tool. So when we fit the corner, we can just raise this piece of lead a little bit. We can use our knife or we can use the Nova tool. Then our other border can just fit nicely inside it like that. Give us a very neat finish. So we're ready to start adding glass to our piece now. We've got our two border leads in place. I've got my internal lead ready. This is my 5mm internal lead, which I've stretched. And now we can start adding the glass, starting in this corner and working out. If you're working on a piece which had a border running around it, you'd probably complete the border on these two sides first and then work out from there. We don't have a glass border around this one, so we get our first piece, insert it in the lead channel, and slide it across, make sure it's in there firmly. Now, I know this is in place because it feels firm. I can see that it's in the lead channel, and I can see the blue line on my plan all the way around the glass, which is just perfect. So now we can add a bit of our 5mm internal lead. The thickness of the lead internally in this window is completely up to you. The one behind me uses a much thicker lead inside. It looks like an 8mm in there. So to make this piece of lead easier to manage, as they come in 2-meter lengths and get even longer once you stretch them, I'm just going to cut this down. So I've got a more manageable length. Now I need to line this up with the edge of my border lead, and I'm just going to bend the lead round so it exactly follows the piece of glass which I have in place. Then I can mark the lead with my lead knife just past the border lead, which I'm going to, because I want this lead to just sit inside the channel of the border. So I'm just going to, a light bit of pressure leaves a indentated line on the lead, and then I can cut that. I'm going to continue to add my interior leads. Where this lead line
meets up with this one, we're going to have to judge that angle and cut the lead so those mitre together just right. So I'm just going to mark off that angle that I need. Cut the lead. Being careful not to collapse the lead. You can just open up the channel a little bit. Now, those leads butt together nicely there. Make sure this is all firm. Just judge just before the glass ends. We're going to cut this here. So we'll just mark that. So I'm going to offer up my lead. Just roughly shape it so I can judge the angle. I'm going to cut a little piece off the end just to perfect that angle. You can open that little bit of lead up there. Hold the lead over, mark where it will come to, including the angle it will come to. Cut that and try it for size. Looks good. I'm going to put a nail here because I know that another lead will be butting against that and there will be a solder join over it, so if I dent the lead at all it will be covered in solder later. If there wasn't that intersecting line, I would use a small block of wood as I have here to protect the lead. Now we can remove this piece. Add our next piece of glass. When you fitted all your glass, you can then remove your fixing from one side and fit your border lead. I'm just going to open this channel up with my Nova tool. I've just cut a piece of lead for my top border here. It's a little bit crooked, so I'm just going to use my fid to open up the channel and at the same time straighten the lead out a little bit. So here we go, running this along, get the lead nice and straight and the channel opened up. So now I can remove my fixing points. You can use a scrap of lead to protect the glass when you're putting in a horseshoe nail, or a block of wood. Just going to open up this lead a little bit here. Just going to add some more support to this side. You may notice me using the butt of my knife to hammer those horseshoe nails in. That can be quite convenient when you're working. That's what this metal part is for. You can of course use a hammer if you prefer, but you may find that more convenient. Now I've used a piece of wood along the top here. That's best because it makes sure the edge lead is nice and straight and supported all the way along. I don't have a convenient sized piece of wood to use along this edge, so I've just held it in with a number of horseshoe nails and pieces of wood, but you need to make sure that this is straight. So we're going to check it with the L square. That's nice and straight. Check all the angles. Until we're satisfied that everything lines up perfectly. Before you move on to the next stage, you should also check your measurements. So we're checking all the angles will come out as 90 degrees. We're going to check the width and the height. Usually you just do that by measuring it with a ruler or a tape measure. But as we're making this window to the exact size of a piece of A4 paper, I can check it against a piece of A4 paper. This is the piece of paper with my plan on it. And if I put that over the top, I can see it's exactly the same size. So there we go. Now this panel is ready for soldering.
To complete the leading up phase of our window, we need to solder every single join. Every place where the lead joins another lead, where they butt together, that all needs to be joined together. Before I start soldering this bit, I'm just going to use the flat end of my fid here to run across gently the border leads, just to flatten down the points where I've raised the lead up a little bit to insert the interior lead into the channel of the border. I want that to sit together where all the leads join. You have to be careful when you're flattening down the lead not to flatten the lead so it's flush with the glass. You need a little gap between the lead channel and the glass, because one of the later phases we'll be doing is cementing the window. We'll be filling all of those gaps with cement. So you want to make sure that you do maintain a small gap in that channel between the lead and the glass. So I'm just going to flatten down my borders here, just enough, not too much, so the lead is touching any other bits of lead but not touching the glass. That looks good. Now we can apply flux. We have to apply flux to every single join that we're going to solder. You can use a liquid flux, in which case you'd apply it with a brush, but I'm going to use this. It's called a tallow candle, and it's kind of solid form of flux. It's just like a candle without a wick, and you simply rub it on every join, and this will act as flux for our solder. What the flux does is remove some of the impurities from the surface of the lead and bring them up to the surface of the flux, and also lowers the temperature necessary to melt the solder, and it just means the solder will bond to your lead properly. If you don't use flux, the solder will not properly stick to the lead. If your lead looks quite dull and it's quite old, it's probably oxidized a little bit, and you may need to use a wire brush to shine up all your joins before you can successfully solder them. We're using 50-50 solder. Solder is an alloy of lead and tin, 50% of each in this case, that's why we refer to it as 50-50 solder. We're ready to begin here. Every join is fluxed, so we can use our soldering iron. This is a temperature controlled soldering iron, which I would recommend getting. The temperature control stops it getting so hot that it will melt your lead. You want it to melt the solder, which has a slightly lower melting point than the lead, but not melt through the lead as well. So you'll need a soldering iron. You'll also need a holder for the soldering iron, so it won't burn anything when you put it down. And they usually come with a bit of sponge in a little bath here, which you need to wet, and you can use that to clean the tip of the iron as you need to. You can also get gas-fueled soldering irons, which we use quite a lot in the studio, but most hobbyists usually use a plug-in soldering iron, and they're just as good. So to solder, you need to hold your solder in one hand, the iron in the other hand. Be aware that the end is incredibly hot, and of course it will burn your skin if you touch it, so be very careful when you use the soldering iron. You may want to hold the soldering iron in your hand like this, or like this. It just depends which you find most comfortable. You need to hold the soldering iron in one hand, your solder in the other. The solder's quite flexible, you can bend it around however you like, just to make it comfortable in the hand. And you need to start by putting your solder onto the join first, then your soldering iron on top of the solder, and you're just going to take a little bit off the end of the stick of solder, melt through it with the iron, hold the iron down onto the join for a few seconds, and then take the iron straight up. So let's do that now. I've got the solder down, I'm going to kind of just melt off a little bit off the end, hold the iron down, lift it straight up, and that's our join done. So I'm going to place the solder on the join, the soldering iron on top, hold it down for a few seconds and lift straight up. That again. When you finish soldering one side, you can remove all of your supports. The window's all held together with the solder now, so we can pull all these out. And here we have our panel. Now I can get rid of this board. Now I've removed my window from the frame it was in. It's all held together on one side by the solder joints. Now I've got a lot of tallow, the flux that I used, stuck to the lead around the joins. So I'm just going to clean that off. It's easiest to do that now. If you leave it, it can kind of harden and it's harder to remove. So I'm just going to get a stiff brush and rub over all of the joins to remove that. If you use a liquid flux, it's also best to clean the flux off at this point. Now the window's all held together and removed from my frame. I can also remove the excess on the borders. So I'm just going to make sure I cut down nice and straight. And we've got a nice square panel. Now all I need to do is flip it over and solder the other side. Repeat the whole process on the other side. For a small panel like this, you can quite easily just pick it up. For a larger panel, they can flex and be quite delicate. The strongest way to hold them is completely upright like this, but to get it to that position, you can slide the panel to the edge of the table, supporting it with this hand, get the edge of the table roughly in the middle of the panel, pivot it, and then you can turn your piece around, do reverse to lay it down. So that's how you'd pick up a larger, more delicate piece. Now I've soldered all the joins on both sides and our panel is looking pretty close to complete. Please remember whenever you're working with lead, it can be poisonous. It can't be absorbed through the skin, but it can be very harmful if you ingest it. So make sure you wash your hands thoroughly after every time you come into contact with lead. Keep it out of the way of children and things like that, obvious things. And if you get a cut while you're working, always make sure you bandage that up, put a plaster on it before you continue to handle the lead. It's quite important. Now the final thing I'm going to do to this panel, so before we finish this session, is use the flattening end of my fid and just run it down the sides to close off this edge channel of the H section lead that I've used as a border, which just closes it off nicely. There we go, and that is how we usually finish our windows that we make here in the studio. So if you look at the edge, just close those channels together and we've got a nice border around our piece. For more information about the windows that we make here in the studio, please visit our studio website. You can find that at www.stained-windows.co.uk. For an extensive range of glass tools, glass supplies, anything you need, just visit our shop, www.sunriseglass.co.uk. And that's this section finished. In the next video, I'll be teaching you how to cement up your window and clean it and put on all the little finishing touches. Thanks for watching.